Will Ospreay's interview got more traction than Dynamite did. So I guess we have to talk about it. I'm actually going to just cue up the audio to when he talks about WWE. I really don't have a strong opinion about what Will Ospreay has to say, because to me it's clearly just him hyping up AEW. But for the record, he doesn't like WWE, and to be quite honest, he doesn't like anything about it, which makes it even funnier. But I'm going to have to respond, so let's get to some of this stuff here. It should be about a good minute or two.
I think it's a bit of both, to be honest with you. Like, I think deep down we know that WWE is like it's a machine, it's an animal. It's gonna be like they're in like giant stadiums and they're doing so good. But like a lot of people look at us and just go like we're doing it wrong because WWE are doing this, and it's like no, there's just different ways of doing it. Hey.
All right. So let's pause. I've heard this before. And yes, there is something to be said that you don't need to follow what someone else is doing. That's true. The issue here is that AEW is not doing as well as they had been doing. And that's the problem. AEW was in bigger buildings before Will Ospreay showed up. They were running Dynamites out of NBA arenas, not running music venues. You know, this is probably more appropriate and better for their audience if we're being honest, but it's not mainstream. You know, AEW is doing things differently, but it's so different that people aren't interested. So if you want to take that to mean that you're doing it wrong, then take it that way. But there's something clearly being done right if WWE has been doing a similar thing, not the exact same, for 40 years and has outlasted all of their competitors. Clearly something's going right in that direction. But I don't know. When people argue with success, I don't know what to tell you. That's why I don't argue with AEW's success. It's a successful brand, but it's not as successful as it was. And that's I'm not talking about 25 years ago. I'm talking about literally 18 months ago. You know, so it's there's some questions that need to be answered.
And like I happily say, yeah, I got into WWE when I was a kid. But like when I became like a teenager, I just thought it was lame. There were certain guys that I enjoyed, like Eddie Guerrero's one, Edge was another one, like Randy Orton's sick. But like after a while, I just was just like, this is so pantomiming, and like I always remember like when people would go like, especially coming up in wrestling, it was like less is more, and like is it like because I'm bored, like it's the same.
Okay. Let's pause for a second. WWE is being the entry point to wrestling for a lot of people when they're children. It's kind of what Vince designed it for. He designed wrestling to be loud, explosive characters, typically for kids. So this is why most people, they get into it as kids and they kind of grow out of it as they get older. Most of the stubborn fans, they want wrestling to grow with them because that's what happened in the Attitude Era. But typically, promotions don't change that much because you end up alienating a certain amount of fans or whatever. But that's neither here nor there. I'm not surprised at all to hear that he was a fan as a kid. The issue that we come to here is when he says that in wrestling, he's always heard that less is more. And he says that, is it? Because I'm bored. This is not a personal shot. It's just facts. I looked it up because I remember him saying this. But Will Ospreay has ADHD. Okay? Which means he has very difficulty focusing, sitting still, and all that stuff. In traditional pro wrestling, before the independents took over and everybody started doing 1,500 moonsaults in the opening match, and then guys were lighting each other on fire and everything. You didn't get a whole lot of everything. And look, I know Meltzer's going to turn around and say, but Lou Thesz criticized Harley Race or whatever. That's not even what I don't care. All right. Getting the most out of something is, look at how hard Roman Reigns works compared to how hard Will Ospreay works. Roman Reigns gets bigger reactions just sauntering to the ring than Will Ospreay gets by doing flips. He sells more t-shirts, his buildings are bigger, and he doesn't work nearly as hard. How did that happen? It happened because he learned how to make what he does matter. And he's older than Will Ospreay. You know? And I believe Will Ospreay's probably been doing this longer than him. You know, so when you start asking important questions, when wrestlers used to actually tour the territories, right? These guys are working 5-6 nights a week. The idea of doing neck bumps or these really sick bro shoulder bumps is ridiculous. When wrestlers became weekend warriors, they started doing that stuff. You know, we're about to run a show every other weekend. Sure, you can go out there and, you know, drop somebody on their head or work very stiff because you don't work that often. But when it's night after night, for weeks on end, months, years on end, you want to find a style that works. This is the difference between people who grew up watching like territory wrestling and old stuff versus people who grew up watching the Ring of Honor shit from the indies where these guys work once a month. Okay? Sure, they can go out there and almost kill each other. They only work once a month. And this also incentivizes them to go wrestle to go work in Japan because they couldn't get enough work in the United States. But learning to adjust your style because you work more often, that's what the old timers were talking about. And they were also basically being smart. Why throw away everything you know how to do in one match? What would be the point? Why should people come back to see you next week if you're just going to do the same thing you were doing before? There's only so much of that stuff they can handle. There's only so much of that stuff they can do. Only so far you can go in getting fan reactions. Weird things get pops in wrestling, you know? But the concept of less is more is always the case. Less is more in everything. You know? It's true in movies. It's true in, novels. It's true in comic books. You can do certain things, but if you do too much of it, people burn out on it, and it stops being important, and it stops being special, and it stops being an attraction. When it becomes routine and people see it all the time, like the moonsault. The moonsault used to be a move that you didn't see that often. Now, who the hell is impressed by a moonsault? You better have a pretty moonsault. Other than that, it's a moonsault. We used to have seen people do 630s and all this sort of stuff. It's not that impressive anymore. The DDT used to be a devastating move. But when you see people DDT each other from the top rope or some guy do a power driver off a scaffold or something like that, are you really impressed by a simple DDT? No. So you have these guys who constantly feel like they need to ramp things up because I don't want to be boring. But in reality, they end up actually making themselves even more boring because they go out there, they do all this stuff. They drop each other on their heads. They kick out of everything. And then the finish is a clothesline. The finish is a small package. And you're like, well, you guys tried to murder each other. It's like you go out there, you get in a shootout, with the police, and it's a 6-hour shootout and everybody's guns are empty. And then all of a sudden you conk out because you got a bee sting. It's like, how anticlimactic is that? But this would be understanding that wrestling has a certain level of intelligence put into it, baked into how you present it, and that certain wrestlers did not pick that part up. They wanted to have what Jim Cornette called these video game matches because to them, this is what's sick. This is a sick match, bro. Instead of this match makes sense, it's this match is sick. You know, fire and barbed wire and all that shit, right? It's sick. It's like, okay, you know, but this is not extreme sports. This stuff eventually comes back to haunt you. But whatever.
Stuff is recycled and it's over and over again. And every now and again you get something cool like the CM Punk pipe bomb promo. Like every now and again something like, whoa, that was sick. And like WWE are on fire now, but like I still, as not only just a viewer but as a wrestler, I just don't enjoy it. I think like I haven't watched WrestleMania. Like what I've heard is it wasn't the best Mania in maybe like Io, Rhea and Bianca was the only sick match on there, which three of them are sick, right? They're three of the best wrestlers, period. But for me, I just never was a WWE guy. I respect it, and I respect the guys doing it. That schedule is like crazy, and I commend them all for doing it. I just didn't like it. I don't like the show. I don't like the style of wrestling. I don't like the presentation. It's got better. I love the one-shots that they've been doing, but I've never been a big fan of it. So that's why when like AEW came along, and they went with more like the sports-based stylize of it, it was something that I could sink my teeth into.
Okay. He's not a fan, guys. Look, it's okay. Not everything is for everybody. You know? People grow out of things. I'm not going to lambast him for that. My issue is that they keep telling this sports-based lie with AEW. Because, for starters, I don't know what that means. Like, what does it mean to be sports-based pro wrestling? When I think about sports-based pro wrestling, I go back to Bill Watts, right? The rules are very strictly followed. You know, guys will get counted. The rules are very strict in Mid-South. And there were a lot of rules, a lot of regulations. You know, you may even go back to maybe like a Gorilla Monsoon when he used to be on commentary. And he would always refer to championship committees and, you know, all this stuff, you know, things that you would refer to in a sport, you know, like instant replays and all these sorts of things, right? When you look at AEW, the rules don't matter. Everybody's in the ring at the same time for as long as they want to be. Going outside the ring, so what? Hitting each other with weapons and stuff, so what? Being on the top rope as long as you want. Virtually nobody cheats, really. You know, if somebody cheats, it's a rarity that someone would even bother to cheat because it's all about putting on a show. And if anything, and I hate to turn this around, but it seems more like AEW is more of the pantomime. When you actually look at what the word pantomime means, because I had to look it up, because I had an idea what it meant, but I wanted to make sure that I was right in what I was thinking. And let's look up what the word pantomime means. It says pantomime is a form of theatrical entertainment, particularly popular in the UK, where performers express themselves through gestures and movements without speech, often to the accompaniment of music. It's a type of musical comedy stage production designed for family entertainment, often based on fairy tales and featuring stock characters. So you can say that there's some WWE here that you can say is, you know, pantomime-y. But performers express themselves through gestures and movements without speech. That sounds very much like AEW to me. Most guys, we've never even heard them talk. But they'll get in the ring and make all their tough guy faces and, you know, do weird dancing and all this sort of stuff. But, like, what does it mean to have a sports-based presentation when you don't follow any fucking rules? When the rules don't matter, how is it sports-based? when there's no commissioner or anybody to enforce the rules? How is it sports based? Because you choose not to do excessive camera cuts, which I know he said he liked the single shots that they've been doing. He went on a rant about that earlier in the interview. I didn't listen to the whole thing, but I did listen to certain parts, and he talked about how much he hates camera cuts, and I actually agree with him on that. But the sports-based presentation that these guys talk about so much, I don't see it. I don't know what that means. It just seems like they're just saying shit. Like, it's what they put in the summary when they started AEW. They're going to have a sports-based presentation, and then they just kept saying it. So now you're expected to believe that Kyle Fletcher riding Hangman Page like a horse is sports-based. You're supposed to believe that Harley Cameron and Anna Jay doing tits and ass or tenacity and aggression is sports-based and not sports entertainment, which is exactly what WWE claimed to be. How are you different if you're doing the same stuff? When you go back and watch like Territory Wrestling, it was sports-based. You had your straight guys, and I don't mean that sexually. I mean just people who were kind of neutral. They interviewed the heels and the baby faces with the same even tone. WWE would, and sometimes you will have an announcer or a commentator or whatever get fired up about a heel's dastardly acts. But for the most part, they were kind of like wallpaper. They did their job. They were authoritative. They told the truth. And that was pretty much it. They really were not characters on the show. They would even be people who used to work in real news, or a real newspaper guy, or a real radio guy who used his real name. This would be sports-based. How is that in AEW anyway the same? I don't get it. And it seems to me like they hoodwinked a lot of people into thinking that this product is markedly wildly different. And what one of the real problems with AEW is that it's a hodgepodge of things. They want to be PWG, where everything is this wacky moonsault fest. But they also want to be ECW, where it's underground and there's barbed wire and blood and cussing. And then they also want to be WWE, where there's these super hot chicks who are engaging in sexualized content, and they're avoiding the superhero element that WWE thrived on for years and years, and even WWE right now is trying to avoid it. But they're taking bits and pieces from everything. They're taking bits and pieces from Ring of Honor in the early 2000s, and bits and pieces from Japan. These slap fests. Guys just get in the ring and start smacking each other in the face all the time for no fucking reason. The fighting spirit and all that stuff. But you can't cater to all of these audiences all the time. Like, these things worked because they would do something, and then their audience would gravitate towards there. Or even if people liked pro wrestling and they wanted to see something different, they knew that they could see something different by going over here. For instance, New Japan is sports-based as far as I'm concerned. There was not a lot of gimmick matches. It was rare to see a cage match or a no-holds-barred match in Japan. They were very loose with the rules, which kind of flies in the face of being sports-based. But it was more sports-based in the United States. It was far more sports-based than WCW or WWE, where the rules basically were just thrown out of the window sometimes, and it was constant chaos and disqualifications and non-finishes and stuff like that. And the matches were not only secondary, they were tertiary. And the match was just a way to get characters in a certain place so that things can happen. Whether the match was good or not was not even of any sort of relevance. I'm talking about during the Attitude Era, right? At the same time in Japan, they were having 45-minute 30-minute classics because that's what they wanted to do. And so while WWE and WCW were de-emphasizing in-ring work, it maintained that in Japan. And so all of these nerds who just want to watch long-ass wrestling matches started watching Japan. And then enough of those guys got together to make themselves a small economy of people who just want to see that stuff. And then over time, you started seeing Ring of Honor and all these other little promotions spring from that. But it's not, that's not the same audience as the ECW fan base. It's not. There's some overlap, sure. Just like there's some overlap with the WWE audience. But it's not the same people. And the same people who loved New Japan, they liked AEW because they mimicked a lot of the New Japan style and they brought in a lot of the same stars. The people that they used to be able to watch in Japan, that they had to stay up till 3 o'clock in the morning to see, now they get to watch them at 8 o'clock at night from the comfort of their own home, and maybe even go to see them live in the venue. So you'll be able to do some crossover there, but you can't bring in everybody. When your umbrella is too big, then nobody actually gets what they want. And so you started seeing that AEW started having that problem. The WWE is unapologetically is what it is. That's when it was under Vince. And now it's kind of wishy-washy. But under Vince, it was what it was. All right? They compromised here and there to keep the fans engaged, but the product was what it was. In terms of in-ring segments, they would do pose downs and comedy segments and all this kind of stuff. Sometimes that stuff hit, sometimes it didn't. All right? But other promotions would avoid doing all that stuff because, oh no, we don't want to be like WWE, except for TNA, which they would occasionally do stuff like that. And they were able to get an audience who didn't want to watch all the WWE stuff, which was fine, but then you realize it's not that many of them. It is not nearly as many as you think. Which is why companies like TNA, which at first avoided it, they didn't want to do it. Oh, they didn't want this. They wanted to do something that was more like the territories. When you read Jerry Jarrett's book about the creation of TNA. You know, Jerry Jarrett wanted to create something that was a little bit closer to the territory system. He didn't want what Vince Russo wanted to do. And that was one of the bones of contention when TNA was created, is he didn't want the Vince Russo vision of what wrestling was that had been on WWE TV and that had been on WCW TV. He didn't want that in TNA. But he got overruled, and that's exactly what he got. You know, which is why he bailed out pretty early when it comes to TNA. But you can't make everybody happy. You have to create your own little niche and then follow through. But AEW has tried to be this schizophrenic bipolar promotion that's full of the most progressive wrestling fans in the world who think that they're edgy, but they are constantly offended by every little thing. Oh no, we're offended that some guy doesn't want to see a trans wrestler or a gay wrestler or whatever. So you have to have speech codes. Okay, then, so now you're nothing like the ECW audience. That's going to be off-putting to them because they were chanting and calling people the F word and talking about how the Dudleys sucked penises and all this kind of stuff. They were a raunchy, loud, aggressive audience. You want to have that, but you don't want that aimed at certain people. So that's not going to work. You want to be on national television, but these guys can't go out there and curse and bleed every week. You're going to run off your advertisers. That's exactly what happened, by the way. So now that's going to piss off a lot of the hardcore fans because, well, WWE doesn't blade. They're super corporate. They try to, you know, all these corporate ad rules and all this bullshit. AEW's not supposed to have that stuff. But it's a business at the end of the day. You can't book hundreds of tournaments and have matches where people don't want to invest in the product. So you just started running people off. It can't be everything for everybody. And that's what AEW has tried to be. And that's part of the problem. So I appreciate that Will Ospreay just doesn't like WWE, but I don't understand what the sports-based thing is. It doesn't make sense to me. Nor do I really understand the appeal of AEW. You know, again, I don't like PWG, and I'm limited with my indies, and I'm limited with Japan. I don't like being overloaded with that stuff. You know, these sort of performers that are brought in because they're great technicians, but they have no personality whatsoever. It's like, no, I think personality is very important in wrestling, and all the wrestling that I enjoy, from territory wrestling to the WWE to parts of TNA to, you know, parts of even some modern stuff, the guys have personalities. I'm not interested in bland technicians, just random guys who, oh my, and that's really what so off-putting to me about AEW is that you'll bring in these guys. Kyle O'Reilly and Roderick Strong are two perfect examples. These are fucking boring people. They never have anything intelligent to say or entertaining to say. They don't dress in a way that captures a lot of attention. They go out there and they wrist lock very good. And it's like, yeah, that's great sometimes, but most, if I'm gonna sit here for 2 hours, I want to see some outlandish shit, you know. And they can't do that. They refuse to do that, which is fine if that's not your brand. But there's gonna be a bunch of people who are gonna look and say, I don't care enough about this stuff to sit here and just watch Roderick Strong, you know, chop and headlock take over a guy for 20 minutes. I just don't care. And you can't be surprised when you look at what works in pro wrestling. I mean, all you got to do, WWE Network is free for the most part. And then if you are one of these people who are perusing the internet, you know, YouTube, all you got to do is, and you don't even got to watch WWE. Watch Mid-Atlantic, you know, the Jim Crockett Promotions. You know, guys like Tully Blanchard had personality. You know, he dressed well, spoke well, carried himself like a star. He didn't need to be the world champion. He jumps off the page when you're watching him, though. And matches could be between a guy who is a superstar and a guy who was a jabroni, and the crowd would just be super excited. I remember I was watching Mid-Atlantic, and the match was Superstar Billy Graham as he is doing the kung fu gimmick, and he's wrestling a jabroni named Brian Adidas, right? And Superstar Billy Graham starts the match, and he's flexing, and you know, he's massive at this point. It's 1985 or something like that, so he's massive, but he's not the Superstar Billy Graham of 1978. By the time Brian Adidas started making his comeback, the crowd is unglued. Now, me sitting at home, I'm like, there's no way Brian Adidas is going to beat Superstar Billy Graham. But the crowd thinks so. And he's not doing any 450 splashes. It's basic wrestling storytelling, where it's a big guy and a little guy, and the little guy is fighting back. And then, of course, they cheat, they cut him off, and then Superstar wins. And the crowd is disappointed. And I'm pretty sure nobody separated their shoulder, tore an ACL, got a concussion, or anything. And the crowd was happy with it. They weren't happy with the outcome. Obviously, they wanted the babyface to win. But it was simple. Like, wrestling is such a simple goddamn process. Like, people just, they make it so difficult. Because you're already way off base. When Cody Rhodes started AEW, I'm gonna piss people off by saying that. When he pitched the idea of there not being baby faces and heels, he was already off track. That's how simple wrestling is. Soon as you say, we don't need baby faces, and you off track. Vince McMahon did this whole, the cure for the common show. We're not going to have good guys and bad guys. He lied. That was a work. There were still good guys and bad guys, and it was clear as fucking day who the good guys were and who the bad guys were. It was clear as day. He lied to you. A little bit more shades of gray. It was bullshit. Steve Austin was a babyface. Period. Who else was the babyface? No, there was nobody. There was Steve Austin. There was Vince McMahon. That was the babyface. That was the heel. That was a story that people followed. That's what worked. Babyfaces and heel, something so simple. And AEW will often go away from that. Who's the babyface? Who's the heel? Nobody knows. There are guys that heel, but there's no reason to boo him. The guys that face, but there's no real reason to cheer him. And they will go throw them out there and they work for 25 minutes. No, everybody's bored. They change the channel. But you all got Will Ospreay's thoughts and feelings about WWE and AEW and all that. And this got a whole lot of attention because WWE fans get all tight-assed about criticism, and AEW fans like to hear this stuff. Ultimately, I mean, it's, you need water to live. You need to make your bosses happy in order to keep your job. So that's how it is. All right. Talk to you guys later, man. Peace out.
No one does it better.